Rajashri, and good afternoon, everybody. So we have talked about basics of communication. Now we will move into more complex situations, which we usually face in palliative care. So there are some specific situations which we hope to discuss today. One is regarding how to communicate some bad news to the patient and family, and they, if the caregiver usually, if they oppose communicating bad news to the patient, how we can manage that situation. And sometimes patient or caregiver gets angry, and usually we are the victims. So can we do anything, or can we manage in a better way in such situations? Once again, I welcome Dr. Biju Raghavan. I have introduced him last week, but still, for the sake of this ECHO program, Dr. Biju Raghavan, who is the consultant in Rajagiri Hospital, Aliva, Ernakulam. He has done his 2-year postgraduate diploma in pain and palliative medicine, and has more than 17 years of experience in palliative care. And we have been working together for a long time. So welcome, Biju, and it's over to you.
Thank you, Sunil. I hope you can hear me properly.
Yes, sir, we can.
All right. So thank you for the warm welcome again. It's such a pleasure to be part of Salim India's program. Welcome to all the delegates. And we have finished basics of communication, some aspects of that during the last session. So today, as Sunil mentioned, we'll be talking about a little bit more of an advanced communication area. So without much ado, let us start. Next slide, please. All right. Today, as Sunil mentioned, we will be talking about how to communicate bad news, little bit about how to manage collusion, and also a little bit about dealing with the angry situation. Please remember, each one of them is a session in itself, but because of the our time constraints, we are trying to club everything together. So next slide, please. So when we talk about communicating bad news, the usual models that we are familiar with is either we tell everything to the patient. In some countries, you are required to tell everything to the patient, and only with the permission of the patient can you talk to the family. So that kind of model is called a full disclosure model, whereby you tell everything to the patient. And in many parts of the world, especially in India, Asia, we do not tell the bad news to the patient. We usually tell to the family. So that would be a non-disclosure model. That is, we do not disclose the bad news to the patient. So these two models are the most prevalent models that we know of. Next slide, please. Now, problem with these two models is that they come in conflict with the patient's right. The patients have the right to know. The patient has the right not to know. So if we are practicing full disclosure model, what about the patient who does not want to know? So therein the conflict comes. Our practice is we tell it completely to the patient, but there may be a patient in front of us who does not want to know. And what about non-disclosure model? We do not tell it to the patient, but what if we have a patient who wants to know? So this is the conflict with the patient's right to know or not to know, which makes these two models, full disclosure model and non-disclosure models, both problematic. Next slide, please. So what do we do? Next slide. So it is important to tailor make a model for the individual. What does the individual want? Whether the individual wants to know or does not want to know. And if the individual does not want to know, we should not push the information onto the patient. If the individual wants to know, then we have to figure out how much the patient wants to know and give only that much of information. So this is essentially an individualized disclosure model. I will repeat, you find out whether the patient wants to know or does not want to know. And once you have figured out, then you give the information to the patient who wants to know. And when we are giving the information, we have to figure out how much information to give. It should be as much as the patient wants to know, not less, not more. That is where that is what we call as individualized disclosure model. Next slide, please. So before we get on to that, the question is who should communicate bad news? So many times when we ask this question, many people say doctor. But remember, being a doctor or a nurse is not a qualification. There are three important aspects. One, the patient should trust the person who is communicating bad news. And it is up to us to earn the trust of the patient. And we talked about some of the skills last time. Secondly, we need to have information. Now, you may say that doctors and nurses are the people who are more likely to have information. However, please remember, we are sometimes handicapped by the fact that all the information that we have is in medical language, which a normal person may not understand. So we have to learn to use common language, simple, easy, everyday language that will convey complex medical situation. That is again a very important skill. And third, but not the least, is the skill to communicate patterns. And as we talked about last time, that this kind of training on communication skills is rarely given in the Indian medical system. So trust information that is easily understandable and the skill to communicate bad news. Whoever has this is good enough to communicate bad news. Next slide, please. Again, then the question that comes to our mind is why should we communicate bad news? Why not just let things be? Well, the reason why it is important to communicate bad news because it gives people a chance to finish off things that they wanted to do. It could be relating to their will, it could be related to business, money, property. It could be about relationship. It is about perhaps saying, I love you. It's about saying goodbye. It's about saying forgive you or I forgive you. So it's about closing the loose threads on relationship. It's about fulfilling the desires. If one is still able to travel and has the strength physically, then may want to see some place. There's a concept called bucket list. That is, I want to finish these things in my life before I die. So only when you know that your time is limited, that you would seriously consider that. So there's a lot of things that one can do physically and mentally before you become physically or mentally incapacitated at the last stage. The second thing is only if you know what is the truth will we stop hospital hopping and doctor shopping. Many times what happens is that we don't tell the patient and maybe one or two very close family members, rest everybody knows. But then the patient's expectation cannot be matched because it is far above their reality. And as a result, what happens is they lose trust in your treatment, they lose trust in your hospital. And as a result, then they say, okay, let me go and see, explore what is available in the next city or the next state. Let me see what is available in homeopathy, what is available in Ayurveda. So this hospital hopping, doctor shopping, system hopping just continues, and many a times people go into poverty because they sell off their house, their cattle, their gold, everything, and then the patient dies and the family is literally on the road with nothing, not a roof over their head. So a lot of poverty is generated because of futile medical uh, seeking of futile medical interventions. And then this third point about barrier between the patient and family. The patient does not know, the family knows, and the family continues to pretend as if everything is okay. And sometimes, when the family feels overwhelmed, they will go to the next room and cry, or they may go to the neighbor's house and cry, or they may go to the relative's house and cry. And many of them come to you and in your OP and they will cry there. But the problem is, they are never able to cry in front of the patient. They never get a chance to cry and hug the patient because there is this barrier of lie between the patient and family. Now the same thing happens to the patient also. Patient understands that something is wrong. Patient may not have clarity on what is wrong, but the patient feels it in his body that I am not getting better, I am becoming weaker. And then the patient sees the body language of the family members and the patient realizes they are not telling me the truth. The patient may not understand what is going on, but realizes that something is not right. And as a result, the patients feel isolated, the patient feels angry, the patient feels alone, the patient feels uh, depressed that people are hiding things from me. So all of this created a lot of relationship problems, emotional problems, and all of this could have been avoided only if we were willing to be honest with the painful truth, because it is important to have an opportunity to hug and cry and say goodbye and say love you. All of those important things are lost in creating a falsehood around uh, this issue. So precious time is lost playing a drama. When life is so short, it is important to be honest, and that is the way to improve and strengthen relationships, not by falsehood. And as a palliative care provider, we talk about total care, not just physical care. How are we going to provide total care if the patient has not been told what is going on? How are we going to uh, go into the depth of the patient's concerns or fears if we are not able to talk freely to the patient? Now, this happens because sometimes the family do not allow us to speak to the patient, and that condition is called collusion. We'll talk about it later. Next slide. So coming to back to the standard operating procedure of how to communicate bad news all over the world, we have a spikes protocol. This is spikes means S for setting up the interview. We have to create the right kind of environment, and then we have to find out the patient's perception or the patient's insight of what the patient understands is going on. And then we need to find out whether the patient wants to know, and that is where the invitation goes out. Do you want to know? And then we share the knowledge, and the knowledge is shared honestly, but in a very, very sensitive manner, in a very humane and empathetic manner. And once that is there, then be prepared for emotions, and we have to allow emotions to be ventilated. And once the emotions are ventilated, then it is time to talk about how we are going to plan and what are we going to do. So that is where the strategy and summary comes. So that is in short how we communicate bad news. So let us go into a little bit more detail. Next slide. So I always say that communicating bad news is like a surgical procedure. There are indications to do it. There is a standard operating procedure, and then there is an expected outcome out of it, just like any surgical procedure. Next slide, please. So there is a pre-procedure preparation. You have to be clear. You have to have clarity about your patient's medical condition. Even if you are the regular uh, doctor of the patient, if you're the regular nurse of the patient, it is still a good thing to just go through the files, and so that you can refresh some of the things. Allocate a dedicated time. In my personal practice, I generally keep aside my evening time. That is once my OP area is becoming quiet. The other OPs are also becoming quiet. It's become in the late evening, it becomes quieter, and that is the right kind of atmosphere I want. I don't want a very busy, noisy OP area to distract from serious conversation. Moreover, in the evening, I am done with most of my work. I may have finished my evening rounds, and then it is time. before I go home, this is the important thing that I would do. If I have to communicate bad news, that is the time I would usually keep. I'm not saying that is the only way of doing about it. It is an individual choice. For me, that works fine. So then, set the environment, have your tables and chairs, have a glass of water, keep drinking water available, keep tissues available so that when people are crying, you can offer them a tissue so that they can dab their eyes. And we use active listening skills, body language, and verbal do's and don'ts that we talked about last time. Next slide, please. So when we start the interview, we are taking the patient's history. We talked about history taking last time, history taking 2.0. And there we talked about finding the patient's insight and concerns. And then we have to explore if the patient wants to. And how do we explore if the patient wants to know? We will usually say, so sometimes the patient themselves may ask us, what is my problem? Why am I not getting better? Or you can, if they are not asking something like that, you can probe. Do you know what is going on? Do you want to know more about your disease? So if something like this happens and they say, yes, I want to know, at that point of time, you first give a warning shot. You do not straight away start telling the problem. You first give a warning shot. Next slide. An example of a warning shot is if it is something serious, would you still want to know? If it is something serious, would you still want to know? Now, the moment you give a warning shot, the till now the interview was going on as a regular interview, and suddenly the moment you give this warning shot, it becomes a serious environment. The person in front of you realizes that there is something serious. This also gives the person a chance to think whether do I really want to hear this or not. So this is the point where the patient will decide whether I really want to know or not. Next slide, please. If the patient does not want to know, then the person may, what do you call, decide to not say yes. The person may say, you give me my medicines, I'll come back next week. Or the person may say, no, no, you tell it to my children, Or the person may not look in your face, they may look down, may not make eye contact. If you are seeing any of these things, then you know that the person is not mentally prepared to hear the bad news. Even though earlier the patient said, yes, I want to know, but when you gave the warning shot, the person does not seem to be interested. So that means the person is not mentally prepared. Next slide. However, when the patient looks into your eyes and says, yes, I want to know, then there is no confusion. The person really wants to know. So this is the point where you differentiate between people who really want to know and those who really do not want to know. So that is the importance of giving a warning shot. So once the warning shot has been given and you have a patient in front of you who wants to know, he looks into your eyes and says, yes, I want to know, then you warning shot and the patient has indicated very clearly that the patient wants to know, then you start communicating bad news like a story. You tell the story of the patient to the patient from the beginning. And as you proceed with the story, you give chunks of information, small pieces of information to the patient. For example, let's create a story straight away. Let's say there was a patient who had some cough and weight loss 1 month ago, and he went to his local doctor, and the local doctor gave him some antibiotics and some vitamins and asked him to come back after 1 week if he is not feeling better. The patient did not feel better and he went back to the doctor. The doctor gave him an advice to get a chest x-ray done. And after seeing the chest x-ray, referred the patient to the big hospital in the city. And in the big hospital, they did a CT scan and then they did a biopsy. And then they found that this disease was cancer. So this is what the story is. But as far as the patient is concerned, the patient doesn't know all the details. So for the patient is concerned, the patient knows that he had an X-ray done. He does not know what the X-ray shows. Then he knows that he has been sent to the city hospital, big hospital in the city, and there a CT scan was done, but the patient does not know what the result of the CT scan was. And then he knows that some biopsy was done, but he does not know what the result of the biopsy is. So there's a lot of gaps that the patient has in the information. Information gap is there. So when you are telling the story of the patient to the patient from the beginning, you just fill in the blank spots, fill in the gaps. So for example, you can say that the X-ray showed something like a shadow. And to find out what the shadow was, they referred you to the city hospital. So you start off with something, a very simple information, something like a shadow. And in the next sentence, it becomes shadow. So something like a shadow becomes a shadow. I'll repeat. They in the X-ray they found something like a shadow, and to find out what this shadow was, they referred you to the city hospital. So that is how you gradually escalate information. You do not straight away say, oh, you have cancer. No, you do not go like that. You start the story from the beginning and you give small chunks of information. And whenever people get new information, it is possible that they may go into a small pause. They may break eye contact to think about it. And when they are not making eye contact, you also stop the story. Next slide. And when they again make eye contact, you can continue the story. So X-ray showed something like a shadow, and to find out what the shadow was, they did a CT scan. The CT scan showed something like a tumor, and to find out what this tumor was, they did a biopsy, and it seems it's something like a cancer. So something like a shadow becoming shadow, shadow becoming something like a tumor, something like a tumor becoming tumor, and a tumor becoming something like a cancer. So that is how you gradually escalate the information. And every time you're escalating information, you watch out for the patient's body language. Watch out how the patient's eye contact is there. If the person continues to make eye contact, that means he wants more information. If at any point of time the eye contact stops, you also stop, because sometimes it's possible the patient is processing this new information. If the eye contact is stopped for a long time and you don't know how to proceed, you can ask, should I proceed? Should I should I tell you more? And at that point of time, if the patient says yes, you can proceed. If the patient does not reply or does not make eye contact, it is possible that the patient had enough of the information. Next slide, please. And when you have a patient who had enough information, then either the story is already over, or the patient does not want to know more. You stop at whatever point, because this is the point that the patient has indicated that I do not want to know more, right? So you stop the story there. The patient may come to you after some time, maybe 1 week or 10 days, and may want more information then. But today, right now, the patient had enough. So that is where you stop. You do not give more information. So this is how you proceed with communicating bad news. You find out by giving a warning shot whether the patient wants to know or not. And once you have very much clearly understood the person sitting in front of you really wants to know, then you proceed with the story and you gradually escalate information till the point where the patient has physically indicated that the patient had enough. You stop that point. Now, wherever you stop, it is possible that the patient will have an emotional reaction. The patient may sometimes get angry, or it's possible that the patient may burst into tears. Or it's also possible that the patient may just hold his head and sit in stunned silence. So whatever it is, we have to allow an emotional reaction. Next slide. And when people are ventilating their emotion, don't say something, don't do something, just be there. Your presence is the most important thing. What you say or what you do is not important. In fact, it can spoil the atmosphere when you try to say something. There are situations where it is best to just be quiet, sit, besides the person or sit wherever you were while you're talking and allow the person to cry. At this point, you can extend a tissue or maybe offer a glass of water without saying anything. Just keep it there. Just push it little in front of them. If they want, they will take it. If they don't want, they will not take it. Don't force anything. So that is the most important part. When people are ventilating the emotion, they may get angry, they may say a lot of words. Just sit and listen. If they are crying, just sit and listen. Just be there. That is the most important message I want to give there. Next slide, please. And once the emotional reaction has subsided, then people may want to ask some questions. They may want to know, what can be done about it. Is it curable? It is not curable. What options you have? So all of that rational discussions can happen only once the emotion has been ventilated. So if you start all this discussion before people have completely ventilated, what happens is it will get all mixed up. So most important thing is when people are emotional, allow them to ventilate the emotion till they calm down, and then you can discuss what is possible, what is not possible, and those kind of things. And when you are talking about it, do not give false hopes, give realistic hope. That was what I was talking about during last session. Sometimes we may have this urge to immediately reach out and say, don't worry, everything will be all right, we are there with you, etc., etc. Those words don't have any meaning. It does not give any kind of, we may feel good by saying those words. It is not necessarily going to help the person who's listening to it. So many a times just a silent presence is enough. And if there is some realistic hope you can give, do that. Do not give unrealistic hope. If you don't know answer to a question that they have, acknowledge that, say that I really don't know, but I'll try to find out, or I'll refer you to a person who may know more about this than me. So it is important to be honest. It is important to be honest about things that you don't know also. Next slide, please. So this we already talked about. So once we have decided, we have discussed, and what are the options, then we come to a decision by mutual consensus. This is called participatory decision making, where we have a medical opinion and we hear the patient and the family's opinion, and together we come to a decision of management by consensus. We decide together of how we should be moving forward. Next slide, please. And before you finish the interview, ask for any clarification, and close the interview by leaving the door open. So now you know what these terms mean from our previous session. Next slide, please. Post-procedure follow-up. If the patient is IP, you can depute somebody to go and visit the patient, or the patient is OP. Then when they have left home, make sure that somebody gives them a call just to find out how they are doing. And please remember, the patient may and the family may require more information, more clarification in the coming days. Next slide, please. So that is what we were going to do about communicating bad news. If you have any questions, you can start putting in the chat box while we proceed to the next topic, which is collusion. Collusion is essentially a conspiracy of silence. Next slide. Where in our context, usually the family tries to come and collude with us. They will come into your room and before they bring in the patient, and they'll tell you, doctor, this my patient has so and so problem. We have not told this to the patient, so please do not tell. So why they are doing that? Because they are trying to protect their loved ones from harm. And who can harm them? We medical people can harm them. How? By, from their point of view, we may inadvertently tell the bad news to their loved one, and in that way we may harm the patient. And that's why they come to us beforehand, before they bring the patient, and request us not to tell them. So essentially they are trying to protect their loved ones. Next slide, please. So most important thing is we have to acknowledge the family's fear. Now forget about the patient. Remember, the family is in distress. We always talk about patient's physical, mental, social distress. Remember, family is also suffering. So right now, pollution is essentially a family's distress management. Please remember, the family is afraid. So accepting and acknowledging that the family is uh, what do you call uh, uh, going to be very very anxious is something that we have to keep in mind. Next slide, please. And you may think that you know communicating bad news is essential, but the family's belief is that the moment you tell the bad news to the patient is going to die, or the patient is going to have a heart attack, etc., etc. So do not challenge, because if you challenge, it will only make them more afraid. It will only make them more anxious. Next slide, please. So what is to be done? Okay, the first thing to be done is agree, agree to pollute. The moment you say, okay, no problem, I will also not tell. And in fact, I usually ask the family, what exactly have you told them, told the patient? And they may say, I have said that it is just an ulcer, etc. So I'll say, okay, shall I also say the same thing? So when I say that I am agreeing to you, and so their anxiety comes down. Doesn't mean that they will start trusting you immediately, but at least their anxiety comes down. And then you go and meet the patient and you keep the word. You do not behind their back tell the patient. You have promised the family you will not tell, and you keep the promise. You will not tell the patient, because you will tell the patient only with the permission of the family. Next slide, please. So what do we need to do now? So once you have seen the patient, the biggest way of winning the trust of the family is to provide physical comfort to the patient. If the patient has pain, breathlessness, restlessness, delirium, etc., whatever it is, if with your palliative medical skills, you are able to provide physical comfort to the patient, and the moment they see that their loved one is now comfortable, that is a huge way of earning the trust of the family. And once you have the trust of the family, you can have more conversation with the family. Listen to the family. And the more you talk to them, listen to them, build up a relationship, the more they will trust you. So it is possible that you can do that in one sitting, or maybe two sitting or three sitting. But it's very important to earn the trust of the family at the earliest. And once you have the family who trusts you, the family will start listening to you. Initially, you have to listen to them. So then later they will start listening to you. And once you have reached that position, next slide, please. It is at this stage that you introduce them to the concept why it is important to communicate that. So all the things that I talked about earlier, hospital hopping, doctor shopping, chance to finish life business, barrier between patient and family, the concept of total care, all of these things you can talk to them eventually once they start listening to you, because now they have started trusting you. So once you slowly introduce these topics, you will realize that now their point of view will slowly start changing. And it is, of course, going to be how skillful you are able to do it, that you will be able to convert the family who is colluding from the colluding to agreeing to communicate bad. So many times the family will ask me, okay, so doctor, can you convey this to the patient? I can't speak about this. So I offer my expertise. I said, okay, fine. You bring the patient tomorrow evening in the OP, and I will talk to him about it. So it is important that you first calm the patient family down by agreeing to collude, get the patient comfortable, and the family will start trusting you. Listen to the family, build up a relationship, and then eventually they will start listening to you. And then when they start listening to you, you bring in these issues in front of them, and help them reorient to from collusion to agreeing to communicate back. Now, remember, if the family agrees that the patient can be given the bad news, I always tell them, if the patient does not want to know, I will not force the information. Even if the family agrees that it is a good idea to communicate bad news to the patient, however, I always tell them it will depend on what the patient wants. Even if the family agrees, I will not convey it to the patient till the patient wants to know. Next slide. Sometimes it's possible that you may not be able to convince the family despite your best effort. And that means you may fail to manage collusion, but that is okay. There is no shame in trying and failing. The only shame is in not trying. So if you have a situation where the family does not agree to communicate bad news to the patient, then well, you can try to provide a little bit of your physical comfort measures uh, to the patient. It is not the best way of going about it, but at least you can provide something for the patient, right? So do not push your agenda, because if you insist, if you push the family, if you say that, if you put pressure on the family that you have to allow me to communicate bad news to the patient, they may take the patient away from you. So whatever good you could have done for the patient, even that the patient will not have. So that is, I think, the end of collusion management. Next is anger. Anger is a high energy consuming negative emotion. So what you have to understand is, it is basically an emotional stress. When somebody is crying, it is emotional stress. When somebody is angry, that is also emotional stress. They're just two sides of the same coin. Next slide. So what is important is to understand how to manage it. So we have to, our body language is very important. When somebody is in severe anger, there is so much of adrenaline that the person cannot sit. So when you see somebody who's standing and getting angry, if you're sitting, you also stand up, because then when you stand up, the body position becomes equal. So you are creating equality. And then you make eye contact. Eye contact will show that you are confident to face the situation. And it is very difficult to get very aggressive with people who appear to be confident. So inside you may be feeling very uh, afraid, but if you are making eye contact, it will appear as if you are very confident. And then when you are standing, you stand with a little bent of your spine to a little forward in a respectful manner, right? A little bit of kyphosis. So that shows that you are respectful. So what is this position telling the person? That this person, that is you, are, you believe in equality, you are confident, and you are respectful. So there is no confrontation, and you do not say a word, you just listen to the person and nod the head in agreement. Doesn't matter what the person is saying. Your agenda is not to engage in a conversation, your agenda is to help this person ventilate the emotion. That is all that you are doing right now. So once you, with this body language, you are allowing, facilitating non-confrontational active ventilation of emotion, the anger cannot be sustained. It will flow down, but still little bit of anger will continue to simmer. So once you see that the person is physically little calmed down, then ask the person to, I want to know more about it. Can we sit down and talk about it? So it is only at that point of time you invite the person to sit, and there also you talk less, you allow the person to talk more, so that the person can tell more and more and more. So the more the person talks, the more the ventilation happens and the emotional stress comes. It is possible that you may not have a solution to the cause of the anger. In that case, just listen to it. In case you have a solution, then you provide that solution. If it is indicated, that is, if you feel it is a genuine situation, only then apologize. Otherwise, do not apologize just for the sake of apology, because it will appear fake, and that will make the person more angry. So if it is very genuine situation, you feel genuinely apologetic, only then apologize. Do not apologize for the sake of it. If there is no need to apologize, don't apologize. That's about it. But listen very empathetically. That body language is what will create the facilitation of ventilation of emotion. So a non-confrontational, active ventilation of emotion is how you manage anger. Now, please remember, we are talking about day-to-day anger situation in our clinical practice. We are not talking about mob violence or people who are under the influence of alcohol or other substances becoming angry and violent. That is a law and order problem. That is not a clinical management problem, and hence, what do you call this structure, this of anger management does not apply there. So I just want to make it very clear. We are not advocating this for a law and order problem, which is, for example, a mob violence, a large number of people trying to create violence in the hospital. Nor are we talking about dealing with people under the influence of alcohol or other substances, because they will not be amenable to this kind of thing. So I guess that's about it. Next slide. Okay, so okay, there is something about yourself also. If you, as a healthcare professional, you're angry, you have to take good care of yourself, because staying angry is never good for you. There's a lot of stress hormones that are involved, right? So, and it is not going to help you at all. It's very good to find a colleague who will work as a spotter, and you also become a spotter for that person. And what is it that they're going to spot? In case you are showing signs of anger, for example, if it is showing in your body language, if it is showing in the tone of your voice, if it is showing in the pitch of your voice, if it is showing in the gestures, so that person should come and tell you, I think you are getting angry. And that is a kind of a feedback mechanism you can create. The moment somebody, this person, the designated person comes and tells you, hey, I think you are getting angry, that will be, you will get a chance to recheck and calm down. And similarly, you should do the favor back to your colleague also. So have the system of designating, it is basically an understanding between two people who will honestly you know, point out that I think your tone is becoming little irritable, just watch out. It will give you time to check out, and that is the way you can control your own anger, because many times we don't realize that we are getting angry. Next slide, please. So I guess that's about it. In case you have questions, either on the chat box or otherwise, let us talk about it. Sunil, I will give the baton back to you.
Okay, thank you, Bitu. So I think there will be some doubts. So this is something which we usually face. So you can ask anything if you want.
How to deal with a situation when the case that is going to be presented, when the patient does not want her family to know, and or a group of the family members don't want another group of, like the children doesn't want the husband to know, or that sort of a conflict. I know it's a little complicated, but how do you deal with the other side of collusion when the patient does not want her family to know?
The principle remains the same, whether the patient is colluding or the family is colluding. Why people collude? Because essentially they are trying to protect their loved ones from harm. So sometimes the patient is trying to protect his or her family from harm, or sometimes the family is trying to protect. The principle remains the same, and the strategy also remains the same. The complication comes where you have a large family with people having different opinions. So essentially what happens is that uh, the principle remains the same, that what is it that we want to achieve together, right? So how I go about it is that I do not have this practice of having two people come to my OP and talking. I never encourage that. I'll say, okay, there are important things to be discussed. I want all concerned people to find time and come and meet. So I usually the way I have arranged I have a small OP, but I have a lot of plastic chairs which I can stack up. So then there, of course, there's my chair, and then there are two bystander chairs, and there is one chair for the patient, the standard configuration of any OP. But I also have a lot of plastic chairs in which I can easily accommodate around 10, 15 people in my room. So I usually have a family discussion where all people concerned. So I do then make sure that everybody is invited, or all the stakeholders invited, so nobody feels left out. And then there is no ego problem. Sometimes if a very important person feels left out, then that person will start to create problems just for the sake of creating problems. So we make sure that everybody is here, so no egos are we don't create any egos, so everybody gets a chance to listen and talk every. And then the second thing is, whatever I'm saying, everybody is hearing it together. So we are creating the information, everybody's on the same page, everybody's hearing together whatever information I'm giving. And then there is this phase of discussion. So some people may say something, and that point of view is heard by everybody. And then somebody may, instead of me, somebody else may be giving a solution to that problem. A lot of solution creation happens when we have that. And then whatever is the final decision, we all are in it together. So what happens is, essentially, I save a lot of time, energy, and effort. A lot of this work is done by themselves, and because they are doing the whole thing, they all come to an agreement. Okay, this is how it should. I sometimes just give a little bit of guiding. Otherwise, what happens? Usual practice: two people will come to me. I'll spend half an hour. Next day, two another people set of people will come. I'll again spend half an hour. Then another day, third day, two set of people other will come. I will go mad. I don't have the time, energy, or effort to do that. I do it in one session, everybody together, takes takes care of. Then I document it. I also write down who all attended. I write the name, the relationship with the patient, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, how many people came, and then I write in points, not in paragraph, just in points what was discussed, and then I sign it. So that is documented also. I hope that helps.
It's a very valid and practical point. Documentation. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
So, Bidu, another question: how do we deal with patients who are more accusatory and want to blame healthcare professionals despite being informed beforehand about their patient's poor prognosis, and to not escalate the situation? This is from Dr. Jurgen.
Okay. From what I understood, um, is how do we manage a situation where they are kind of blaming us for not having done everything? Is that what I understood?
Yes, sir. Yes, actually, and if I were to give an example, we had a patient. It was a baby, a newborn baby, who came with severe birth asphyxia. It was HIE grade 3, and from the beginning itself, the parents were explained about the poor prognosis. They were asked to go to a higher center because we didn't have a pediatrician at. We work in a rural hospital, but they didn't want to. They didn't have enough money, so we tried whatever we could, and they refused mechanical ventilation as well, sir. So when the patient finally expired, despite all our efforts, they were saying we shut off the oxygen and the other things that I think they were mostly in denial, but they were informed at every step of the way, sir. So I wanted to know, how do we deal with situations like that, sir?
All right. So as palliative care physicians, we are dealing with this situation uh, all the time, because taking care of terminally ill patients is the main thing that we do. Now, when we are dealing with this kind of situation, please understand that the family is in high state of emotional distress, which is understandable. Or along with it, there is usually an accompanying sense of guilt, whether they did everything that could have been done or should have been done. There's also the associated anxiety of how they will be judged by others. Sometimes they may have a relative who may be accusing them that you did not do enough, etc. So all of this kind of culminates. So usually the medical professionals' reaction to it, we did everything possible. We did everything science could have done. We could everything what we have. So basically, we are trying to justify our side. Now that does not usually help. So my strategy is, whenever I am dealing with a situation like that, I give them a sense that they did everything possible. Whatever was humanly possible, they did. So usually my sentence would be, you know, you have done the most, whatever you I could think of, you have done. You worked very hard. You took your patient to wherever possible. You worked so hard. You struggled so hard. You somehow managed to find money for all the treatment that you did. So I make this whole conversation about them, that you did so much. You did such fantastic work. You worked so hard. You did whatever was humanly possible. And the moment you start using this method, you will see that they start calming down, because you are validating them. You are validating them, and then their anxiety comes down and their guilt comes down, because then they can say, they can go and tell others, see, the doctor said that we did everything that was possible. And their own sense of inadequacy and own sense of guilt also comes down, because here is a doctor telling them that you did everything that was possible. So that is how we should turn the conversation. Many times I see my colleagues saying that we did everything that was possible. What we did is immaterial. We have to convey that what you did was excellent. There was nothing more that you could have done beyond. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, sir. I'll remember that next time, sir. Thank you so much.
Yes, yes.
So Dr. Sheldon asked, what would you do if the patient and family decide not to take treatment in the early stage of the disease? Since we know that they will come back with advanced disease when treatment options may be very.
I guess I will ask others also to chip in this, because I'm sure there may be differing opinions on that. If it was me who is dealing with a situation where, because as a palliative care person, I'm usually not the one who's dealing with it. Most of the disease treating doctors would perhaps face this. You have advised a management, and you see that the patient and the family are not in favor of it. So the thing that would come into my head is why, and I would ask them, okay, you understood that you have this problem, and you perhaps understood that this is the treatment or surgery or whatever is what is required, but you do not want to proceed with it. I'm curious, could you tell me why you don't want to proceed? So it is at that point that they will tell you why they don't want to proceed. It could be either a logistical problem, which includes financial problem. Logistical problem may not be only financial. It could be not having a bystander to come and stay with them, because if somebody were to come and stay with them, then that person cannot go and earn, and then the family would starve. It could be anything. So it could be a very, very genuine reason from that, or it could be a belief, a firmly held belief. For example, there are many beliefs I come across. For example, one belief I come across often is that if you take radiation, you die. We know that is not true, but for people who have a belief and they strongly believe that, then those are the reasons which contribute to them taking a decision to go for it or not. What is in our hand? In our hand is to explore why they don't want to proceed with it, and in a most humane and empathetic way, try to explain the possible consequences of not proceeding with the evidence-based medical practice, knowing that if they do not agree with you and your scientific information, we will not hold them at fault, and we will take the best possible care to them when they come back with an advanced. The only thing that we can provide them is information in the best possible manner, in a language that they can understand. So two things: explore why they don't want to, and then try to help them come to get more information. So I would like to hear about this, Sunil, if you could add on to that.
I think Dr. Anisha has a comment here. Anisha?
Yeah, yes, sir.
You are not audible.
I agree with Bijis. We encountered with no. Is it? I think I have.
And
Hello. Am I
Yes,
audible
ah,
now?
yeah, now you are.
Because I think this is a common scenario we encounter in OP, because patients come to us with early stage of disease, and they will be afraid of the chemotherapy because it may lead to many side effects. They have some false ideas which are feed to them by the neighbors and all. One person, he took chemotherapy and he suffered a lot and then succumbed to death. It's like that. So even in early stage, people have a belief that sadly the cancer is very incurable situation. There is no cure for cancer. Many people have that concept. I think the main reason behind it is those who have cured of cancer, they won't come forward and say like that. Those only the because they I don't know about social stigma, and they won't try to discuss about it to anyone else. So the people who have suffered like that stories are usually fed to them. So it is usually a hard time for us to convince them that this is a curable situation, and the treatment options are available. The side effects are minimum, like that. It is, but we can. It is actually if we spend a lot of time with the patient, we can definitely make them accept the disease status and add the treatment options also. I think I have experienced many in my OPD. Initially, they will be very much reluctant about taking the treatment. One, as Sir told, it's financial issue. It is, they think that cancer treatment is very costly. It is exhausting. It is a one thing. So in that situation, if they can't afford treatment, I usually offer them, they can go to government centers, take treatment free of cost. Now, that one thing we can resolve. Then the next is about the side effects. We must be if we clearly discuss with the patient about the treatment side effects, and if they anticipate it during treatment also, it is easy for them to follow it also. That is also a communication with the patient prior to, we have to give them what are the complications they will develop, especially hair loss. It is a very stigma for especially the females. When they develop hair loss, they tend to drop the chemotherapy treatment and they will go for alternative method like like homeo, naturopathy and all, and will come back to us in a very advanced disease which is incurable. So I think that is very important. We have to communicate, like Sir told, to convince them that this is curable, the treatment options, we can manage the side effects and all. It is very important. It's a,
So there is an interesting
it's a
question.
scenario which is happening every day.
If they opt for any other forms of treatment unscientific, should we go on with for our explanation and explain the lack of rationale for their choice?
Uh, yeah.
To me,
It's a
or
question which we can debate, but yeah.
Is anybody taking that question?
Somebody was talking. Who was that? Dr. Anisha or somebody else? Okay, I think Vijay, you can take.
Okay, I always say there is no shame in trying and failing. The only shame is in not trying. So, what is in our hands is to try, right? And it's also important that when you go back home and sleep at night, you have a clear conscience. You are able to sleep knowing that you tried. Now, you can't make all the problems in the world right, but you can try. So sometimes you are able to get things done. Many a times things will not happen. That is the reality. But for your peace of mind, to sleep soundly with a clear conscience, you have tried. That's enough. Ultimately, when you are taking care of your patients, it is also important to take care of yourself. So do not have a troubled conscience. And the only way to have a non-troubled conscience is you tried. Rest, no, it is what is written for the patient. So whether they do not take your advice or they take even if they take your advice, there is no guarantee actually that things will work out as you hope for. Many times it works. Sometimes, despite the best evidence-based medical practices, the outcomes may not be as you would have wished for. So that is not in our hands. What is in our hands is to try and try.
One thing to answer, especially in palliative, like stage 4 setting, we don't insist much, because if we also don't have much to offer to the patient, sometimes if there is some placebo effect in certain cases, it will be there. So, but in the case of a radical early curative condition, we must be a bit more adamant. I think that's what I usually do in my practice. But still, what
I
you told,
agree
yeah.
that you must try. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, we must. Yeah,
What
yes.
is in your hand is the trying of it.
Hmm.
So
Yes, otherwise-
don't feel upset if
Hmm.
the cosmos does not move according to the way you want it to. Right?
Yes.
What is in your hand is to try, and as long as you are convinced that you tried hard enough, right enough, that is all that matters.
Yes.
Yeah. So I agree with you. We cannot do all the things all the time, and we will not. We have to do our part, but we may not have the result which we wanted. Uh, so it can even patients and families. We have to think that the body, whose body is this? This is my body, and I will do whatever I wanted. I have more rights on my body than you, the doctor. So even if you tell me with all the pros and cons, and even if I understand, I may take a decision which you have to respect. So even though it may be a curative condition, but then we have to try. But the final decision will be taken by the patient, which we have to respect. If the patient is in good sound of good mind, and if they understand the pros and cons of not doing that intervention. I think we will more hear about it in ethics. And there is one more question which I think is relevant, and we hear it usually. Sometimes family member ask same questions many times just to listen one answer. The answer is everything will be all right. In that case, how many times a practitioner should communicate?
I'm not, I didn't understand what the question was. Can you just repeat it?
Yeah. Sometimes the family members ask same question many times just to listen or just to get the one answer. The answer is everything will be all right. So in that case, how many times a practitioner should communicate with the patient and family?
You're probably talking about the family who comes and
Yeah.
asks. Okay, right. So we have to understand it is a normal human tendency to desperately look for some positive, and when they come and talk to us, they are trying to basically clutch at straws. They're desperate to hear one positive message from us. And when that is not coming, they'll just keep coming. So it is one thing that we have to understand is not to get irritated, because it is just a human instinct to desperately look for some positivity. So what should we do when they come and ask? We explain to them. Next day they come, we explain and again to them. The third time also we can explain the same to them, and the fourth time we can, you know, just smile or just listen to them, and we use more of a body language. Not really, you don't have to say anything, so they just understand that you're just trying to convey the same thing without actually saying something. Another thing that you have to keep in mind is they may be in a state of denial. Now, being in denial is not a bad thing because it is a survival instinct. When you are faced with extreme emotional distress, just going into denial is a form of psychological survival mode. As long as it is not affecting the actual patient care, allowing the patient or the family to be in denial is perfectly fine, as long as it is not interfering in your care to the patient. If it is interfering, then you may have to be a little bit more firm in how you are going to break the denial of the patient or the family. Maybe I'm just using a little bit of technical communication jargon, if I may say that. In case you need some clarity on what I just said, I'll be happy.
So another common thing connected with this problem is the same person will go and ask to the multiple team members. It may not be directed towards you, but to the nurse, to the social worker. So as Viju told, and as you told, they wanted to get the answer. Everything will be all right, or he will be okay. So something like that. So it is important that all the team members should have the information about the patients, so that the messages conveyed will be the uniform. Otherwise, there will be problems within the team. So this is why multidisciplinary team meetings are very important. And if you have a team, all the please try to keep the all members updated about the patient information. So I think, yeah,
I totally agree. Yeah.
Can I share? Can I ask a question, please?
Yeah, this will be the last question. Yeah.
Okay, I just there was a scenario in our hospital a few days back. A patient in the ICU, more like with COVID illness, was quite sick. It was she was admitted for 3 days. Every day update was given to the family about how bad the patient was progressing. And they were not willing. DNI and DNR was obtained. They didn't want to do anything if the patient dies. And on the third day, they were wanting to take the patient away by themselves, like, forcefully. They wanted to take the patient home, like Lama. And when they got the Lama done and they went to pay the bill, and in that a few minutes of time, the patient passed away because the patient was really very sick. And when they came back and knew that the patient died, they created such a lot of issue there. So I was wondering, where did we go wrong? Would you be able to help us in that? Because we were updating them. They had said that they didn't want any patient fell sick or critical. But then, but the issue was really very sad that everybody in the hospital management had to come to, to talk with the patient relatives to quieten them down. So that was a big issue in the hospital.
Uh,
That,
why do you think that something wrong happened from your end? You did the right thing. That's about it. All that you were witness to was an emotional ventilation by the family because such a tragedy happened in their lives. And when, as I mentioned before, when your emotion can come in the form of tears, or it can come in the form of anger. Both are same different sides of the same coin, and the coin is emotional distress. So when we talked about how to handle anger, how to facilitate ventilation of anger in a non-confrontational, active way. That is all that was required. Now, problem is these techniques are not part and parcel of our medical training program. It is not part of our healthcare training program. How to manage anger is something that all doctors, all nurses, and all administrators must know. We are so particular about learning basic life support and advanced life support. This is a major life support for us, how to manage anger. So that is all them. They had a tragedy and they were venting out their emotion. It was coming in the form of anger. That all that was happening there. It was just a matter of managing anger.
And maybe I think if you would have called them after the death of the patient, maybe after a few days, and just tell them we are calling from such and such place, and we just wanted to know, are the ceremonies finished, and how are you doing? So maybe that might maybe an invitation to talk, and even they may apologize to. I don't know. Just a
thank you. Yes.
So I think, shall we move on to the patient story, which will be presented by Dr. Harsha.
Good evening to all. Hope I'm audible.
Yes, doctor, you are.
Shall I start, sir?
Yes, you can start.
I'm Dr. Harsha. I'm associated with an NGO, Malabar Cancer Care Society. Means we mostly deal with early cancer detection. We are more into camps and all field activities. Now we can have patients in the center also. So few months back, in a camp, I had a 43-year-old female. Her diagnosis was infiltrating ductal carcinoma in the right breast. Next, please. Uh, Actually, that person did not have any complaint. She just came for the cancer awareness camp. In that camp, we had the mammography test also was done after the clinical breast examination. Then the only complaint she had was she was having medication for hypothyroidism since 2018. She did not have any complaint. But next slide, please. till the clinical breast examination. After the in the clinical breast examination also, there is as such something she can identify, nothing was there, like she did not have any pain, any color change, nipple discharge, nipple retraction, nothing she had. It's just that she was just having medication for hypothyroidism only. Next. Yeah. After the examination was done, actually I found a hard lump in her breast, and I just mentioned about that because the mammography test was done at the campsite itself. In the mammography test, it was like in the mammography test, since it was in the quadrants, almost in the outer quadrant, we got the result as Barrett's 1. We didn't have any finding in the mammography test results. There was nothing malignant, something related to malignancy was not there. But I just had a doubt, so I didn't keep it there. I just invited her to our center for fine needle aspiration cytology. And later on, means at the in the fine needle aspiration cytology, we found she had cells of, means it was malignant. It has to be treated, and then it was sent to the tertiary center. Next. In the mammography, actually in the clinical breast examination, the heart lump was in the margins of the outer quadrant of the right breast at almost 12 o'clock position. After the CBE itself, I just mentioned, because I cannot completely, I just have to inform that she should not be completely happy, or she should not be not given some false hope. If anything also, we should clear it off. I felt like that. So I had recommended, and she had come also. She was a school teacher. Next slide. She's a school teacher. Actually, we had conducted the camp in the school. So just at random, few colleagues, few teachers had attended the camp. Her husband is an IT professional. They had 2 children of age 8 and 15, school going. Her son was in 10th grade. So she was like, her main thing was like, if any problem. After that, she came and I informed her about this. Her main issue was that whether she'll be able to help her son is in her studies, and will she able to continue her career as a teacher? Will she be able to continue? And how can she convey this message? The main thing is that actually this lady knew about self-breast examination, but did not practice that in a proper way or regularly. That's the main thing. And when actually after the identification, we had sent to the tertiary center, and now our actually mastectomy was done, and for chemotherapy is on the, means it's going on, chemotherapy is going on. But first, when she came, when I gave the FNAC result, when I had to say, because after the mammography result, she was expecting that it was fine, but still we had done, and I had to convey that there is a problem in this. She had told that she had a family get together in a few days, that's 2 or 3 days. Can you keep this? Can I not tell my husband till then? It was the thing she asked me. I don't know now also, I don't know whether what I did was right or wrong, but I did not, I went with the patient. I did not ask, I did not force her to do so. And the best thing is that she took her husband the next day, so means after a few days, 3 or 4 days, she took her husband to our center and came to us. And we could talk properly. She was actually, though she was an educated person and she knew about all those things, but when she knew that, I had to tell that, she was like, is it required to do the treatment? Because that first question that arose in her was that, because she didn't have any issues then. And the main issue was how to convey this message to her family. That was the biggest one, because she was like, she had such a good family. Her husband was very caring and very loving. So that was like, sir said, the opposite way. Like the patient wanted to convince, save her, did not want to hurt her family. Next. Now she's after in the tertiary center, she's had finished her surgery, and now she's under certain medications, injection Pregex, Cap, Apricap, Tapan, Pragaba, Zeradol, Bekizols. Now she's fine. Till I'm contacting her. She's in good touch with us. She contacts me for any personal, means like anything regarding this and all. Ma'am, next. Yeah. Her means when she knew about this, the main concern was that to tell her family, then her career, and how to face her colleagues, because in the camp it was conducted at the school itself. She just informed her head only the thing, because her head, because she have to go with the career, so her head only knows this thing, and none of her colleagues know this. So she was like, will the result go to the school, or will someone else know about these things? I was like, don't make it a problem. We won't, from our side, we'll keep it, means that that part will be cleared off. These were her main concerns. Next. 43-year-old lady diagnosed infiltrating rectal right breast after attending an awareness camp. Treatment taken from a tertiary treatment center and now under regular follow-up and review. Next. Actually, I want to know, means now I can better relate it better. Before, means when I was preparing this, my concern was like, if there was any other way of breaking the bad news to her, or that means I delayed it. Actually, when she asked me to delay, I had delayed. I had informed the patient, but her family, I could have directly called, but I didn't do that. Was it right? What I have done, was it right? And should I give any kind of, sir clarified it actually, Vijay sir actually clarified it, but if was there any kind of, should I have given any kind of false hope to make them mentally prepared? So this is the thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sasta, for a good presentation.
Thanks.
Anybody who want to comment on what Harsha was asking, whether she did it right, because she went with the patient and delayed the information regarding the bad news to the family. Was it right or wrong?
First of all, I think the awareness camp and the purpose has been solved. You have been able to find out something which is asymptomatic. You've caught it early. So I think for that, you should be congratulated. The whole program is a great success. And yeah, I think today's class would have given us a better way, better protocol on how to deal with the situation. But I think you were right in going with her request for delaying the information to her husband for the next few days. So I think that way you are right. But I think this class would have clarified all your doubts.
Yes, that's true.
Anybody else have any opinion?
I think I can really, the scenario is quite common in our country, especially for breast cancer, where females are very reluctant to, share even with their husbands or with the rest of the close family about the degree to which they are affected. And some of them keep it for many years together till it is fungating, and just because of the stigma of, and probably the financial implications that the malignancy can bring. So I really appreciate that you could handle it well.
Sir, one more thing. Actually, usually in our place, actually we go for camps and all. We first conduct a class, just an awareness class, how to do self-breast examination and all in detail, because the women usually keep all those things to themselves until it becomes, if they cannot control under their arm, then only they start speaking about this to our family itself. So usually when we go for a camp, there'll be many persons will be invited, but then most of them will be like, we are afraid to come to the camp. That's the thing they say. We are afraid to come to the camp. They don't understand that if we find it early, these early detectable cancers, if we find it early, like oral breast or cervical and all, if we find it early, we can cure it off well. That concept is not like, still it is not acceptable. They are like, if we go to the camp, they will find disease. That's the thing they're feeling. They are not, they are not convinced about the fact that they are, for some, at least for some time, they'll be like, it's okay for them. That concept is not clear to them. That's the major issue we see in our scenarios, in the society now.
Okay, Harsha, yeah.
2 points. First of all, I think I should congratulate my colleague. We are working together. In fact, we are in the same field, for insisting on FNAC in spite of Birat's finding. She had that doubt, and usually it is, say, it's only Virat. That was really great. And another thing is the difference between a clinical breast examination and self-breast examination. Probably a routine, regular thing would have picked it up. Even otherwise, we find it in our camp. Those people who are doing regular sometimes miss it. So there is a difference with expertized clinical breast examination to pick up camps. So those are, it's not about the breaking the bad news. And those things I think she handled very well. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Sunil, sir.
Harsha, why do you think she was not revealing the information to the husband for that 3 days?
Sir, actually, I had asked her because I was like, because the main thing is that there was actually, it was like her daughter's birthday was there in 3 days. So she was like, all our family will come. If I say something like this to my husband, he can't bear it. That was the thing she told me. Openly, she told me this one because he's such a caring person, and I cannot think, but he'll break down. If there was a thing like he can't bear such a thing. Just after the function was over, the next day itself, she told him and she took him over here. And that person also, he was also very caring and all, that's fine, but still when they came, no, they were like, oh, what is the status? He was like, is it something, means like, is it something incurable or something like that? Then I had to convince him about this, what is the status. She did not have anything in the beginning till now. Actually, that moment also, she didn't have any issues. It's like, it's just our part, that early detection is our part, no? So like that only we had a doubt and we had proceeded for it.
Yeah. So this is like collusion between the patient and doctor
Family.
to hide the information from the family. So here also, the patient wants to protect her children and the husband
Yes.
from the enjoyment that will occur after 3 days. So she wanted that let them enjoy on the day of birthday, and because they might have planned it before, and they might have invited people, and so she don't want to spoil it.
Yes.
So I think it is right to go with her, because even otherwise, considering the autonomy of the patient is the supreme. Patient is the supreme person to decide about whether to tell or not. So here the patient is telling that let us inform the husband after the birthday or the party. So I think it was okay from you to go along with the patient.
Thank you,
And
sir.
how to break the bad news, which we have already discussed, and about false hope. So, what are the opinions from the participants about giving false hope to the patients? Yeah, Dr. Anisha.
I think breast cancer is one of the malignancy in which we can detect it early by screening as well as treat it curably. It's a very, if we detect it at early stage, it has a very good prognosis. So most cases, what happens, the females, they have a like an altruistic attitude. They think that they will suffer, but let the family be happy. It usually happens in our scenario. We have come across a lot of patients like this in RCC and all. They will have a very advanced fungating malignancy. Still, they will tolerate that severe pain. Still, they won't say anything to the family members. Might be the child may have a marriage, or her child will be studying. It will affect the children. They are not being aware. If the mother gets affected, it will be a great shock to the children. They want to deny that fact. That is what the basic psychology, it happens. And next case is in cases of, unless it is a metastatic setting, even if it is a metastatic setting, we have good treatment options in carcinoma breast. So in any stage, we must encourage the person to take treatment, as well as in early stage we should convince them that it is a clearly a curable situation. And also I think the cancer screening in the case of breast cancer must be known to the many people, because like the guidelines like clinical breast examination, self breast examination, and attending regular camps, it should be from the PHC level itself, it should be made to be known to the all people, because many are unaware of it. Usually in the malignancy in later years, it was after 50 years and all, but now we can see young women like 30 years from itself, there is lots of female breast patients are getting affected. So the now the guidelines are saying screening should be begin even from the 25 years onset, because early age breast cancer is very common now. So it's very, I think this person, she's actually lucky to have detected a malignant mass, especially left in outer quadrant. It is usually missed because the bulk of breast will be more in the outer quadrant. So screening, that's why mammogram also missed it. BI-RADS one it showed. So it is a very good achievement from the screening part also to detect it early. That's why she was cured and on follow. It's very appreciating their effort.
Sir,
Okay.
sir, in
Yeah.
between, Chetan ma'am had, it's like since it was detected early, I suppose it is not false hope. There is hope that she would be cured. Ma'am had asked that. Yeah, it's right. But people, when we say something about cancer and all, they always take the picture to the tertiary state. That's like, since they have a, in the mind, they keep like that. It's like, it's the end. What it might be just the early thing, but still they feel it like that. And so I was like, she was like, I had told everything to the lady. She was very much convinced, but her husband had taken it like, is it curable itself, or is there any more, if it is spread to somewhere else? That was the things he had asked me. So I was like, she was prepared, but it was more difficult to make her husband prepare for this. Actually, ma'am, I just wanted to know, it was just like a point of discussion only, like mentally, if we wanted to make the person more prepared, should we give like the main concern? Another main concern was like when she takes, it's now online classes and all, when she takes a class, if after the chemo, if the hair goes and all, will I be able to take proper class? These small things were her main concerns. It was main concern for her, it's main concern for us also. But it was difficult to make them understand these things. And I had given like, there will be issues, but everything we can, we can we come back to your old status itself.
Yeah. So we know that the concerns of the patient may not be regarding the malignancy that they have. They are thinking of something else. How my husband is going to be? How will my children suffer? Will they be able to go to school, etc.? So the other thing is only secondary for them. This is not only for females, but also for males also. So here, I think in this patient, or in whatever be the stage of the disease, then I think we have to give realistic hope, not unrealistic hope. So false hope. And if we don't know the answer, then I think we should tell them, okay, I don't know the answer now. We will discuss with somebody and we'll come up with the answer. Because if somebody asks me about the treatment, I don't know whether she needs surgery or chemotherapy or radiation. So I will tell her that, okay, sorry, I don't know the answer right now, but I will get back to you with the answer. I will discuss it with the oncologist and will come up with the answer. So we have to give a realistic hope, not the unrealistic hope. So even if the patient is in stage 4 disease, then also I think the realistic hope would be, even if your cancer is not curable, we are going to be with you to treat your difficulties or suffering. We will be with you. So that would be the realistic hope at that stage of malignancy.
So suppose if this patient asks, will this recur again? So what will be your answer at that time?
I think
We detected
Anisha,
early, but still,
ഒന്ന് നോട്ട് ചെയ്തേ കൊടുക്കുക.
Anisha, can you?
Okay, whether I think whether the disease will recur. That's what.
yes.
Yeah, that was good.
Actually, in all cases of malignancy, there is, even in a stage 1, there is a chance of recurrence. So even stage 1, we say that 90% we can cure it, but still there is 10% chance of recurrence of the disease. So in breast cancer, the recurrence depend on the molecular biology of the tumor. But we can give them hope that this is 90%, there is no chance of recurrence, but the patient has to undergo regular follow-up. It is very important, because if there is a guidelines for the follow-up, in first year it should be 3 monthly, then it should be after till up to 10 years we have follow-up the patient, because after 10 years less chance for malignancy to come back. So regular follow-up is a must. We cannot give 100% evidence that 100% proof that the disease will not recur. Patient has to undergo follow-up, but we can convince them that there is, if we undergo follow-up, there is, even if it is recurred, we can detect it, and earlier recurrence can be detected, and still we can treat the patient. That's very important. To get early initial, it happens in some cases.
Okay, thank you.
So, I think we.
I think I'm clear.
Yeah,
You are clear.
Yeah. So even in case of early detection, there is a mild chance of recurrence of cancer. So mostly we will tell her that, okay,
Yes.
the chance of recurrence is very it's very small, and yeah, the important thing is that you have to go for the follow-up at the correct interval, so that even if it occurs by chance, we can detect it first, and then we can try to treat. Okay, so I think we will wind up the session now. So
hello, sir.
Dr. Biju.
Thank you, Dr. Harsha, for that nice presentation.
Thank you, ma'am.
Hello.
Yeah.
Sir, I just want to ask one thing from the ma'am. First of
Yeah.
all, congratulations, ma'am, for because you are running such an awareness camp and rule out the asymptomatic case in such early stage. I just want to know one thing. Sometimes the patient, like in your case, the patient don't want to tell his or her family about his or her condition. So is it our job to explain the patient the harmful effects of not explaining this thing to his or her patient, his or her relative, about the disease?
Yeah. Actually, Biju explained it in detail, that if a collusion can occur from both sides, maybe from
Yes, sir.
patient and doctor colluding with the against the family, or usual situation is family and the doctor is colluding to hide the information from the patient. But here now we came into an opposite situation. But whatever be the situation, the principles are same. We have to tell the patient why it is important for the family to understand about the disease. And Biju talked about a few points by which you can talk to the caregiver. And I think maybe with the continued communication, we can come to a conclusion regarding the communicating bad news to the family.
Okay, sir.
So thank you, Dr. Harsha, for that
Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am.
beautiful patient story. And thank you, everybody, for active participation.